Hey everybody, and welcome to today's episode of Turning Readers into Writers. And I am your host, Emma Dhesi. I'm a book coach and I'm a thriller writer, and I know what it is like to try and write that first book. It's hard, isn't it? It's a tricky business. Not only are you grappling with the craft of writing itself and understanding how to put a sentence together, a paragraph together, a scene together, but then also trying to grapple with the big picture of, 50,000 or more words to write this big, long piece of story, basically, of storytelling. And it's a very different skill, isn't it, between being a raconteur and telling a story and using your voice, your intonation, and your expressions, your body language and your facial expressions to tell a story, but then putting that onto paper and applying those same skills but in the written format. It's two different skills, and I remember grappling with this all so well, but trying to figure out, how do I do this? How do I put this on paper? And it took me a long time. But when I finally finished that first novel, I've said it before and I'll say it again. And even though it sounds dramatic and I didn't realize it at the time, it really did change my life. And afterwards, I thought to myself, do you know what? I want to help other writers, particularly other women writers, to do the same. So if this is a dream that you've had for a long time, perhaps since childhood, perhaps it's a more recent dream, but it's something that you want to achieve. And it might just be to write one book and know that you've done it, but maybe it is to write a back catalogue of stories that you can sell and have readers enjoy and love and plead for more. So either way, whichever way it is, I want to help you do that because I know how life-changing it can be. And I'm not talking about life-changing in terms of financial gain or status, although those are lovely things as well. But really that change that comes inside of you when you realise that you can achieve a creative goal that you've got, when you can delve deep inside of you and pull out something magical, that you can create something from nothing, and create pleasure and enjoyment for people through your words and through your stories. That in itself can be life-changing. And one of the other ways that it helped change my perspective of myself was that for the first time I realised and saw the evidence of, if I stuck with something for long enough, if I was consistent with it and came back to it time and time again, I would get to where I wanted to be and I could achieve something monumental. And that was my first book. And I've gone on to replicate that just by sticking with it, coming back to things time and time again. I've written and published second, third, fourth books and so on. And I don't want it to end there. But part of that transition for me, part of that life-changing moment was knowing I want to help other writers, other creatives, particularly other women who are perhaps in that second half of life, as I was, to know that you've still got it. You can still do it. You're never too old. And this is something definitely worth striving for. And today I wanted to extend upon that and ask you to start thinking like a writer. Haha, and that's very different to thinking like a reader. When we're thinking like a reader, we are picturing that finished book in our hands, the one that we've picked off the shelf in our house or in the bookstore, and we start reading. And we read it from beginning to end, and we read it linearly. And it might be written linearly and it might not be, but that's how we read it. And before we've written our own book, we can often think that, wow, that writer is so clever. They've known where exactly to put each chapter, how to move the story along. And we imagine in our heads that they've done this in one fell swoop, that they've written that first draft as pretty much as we are reading it in the book that we've picked up in the store. We don't always realise that in fact that book may have had chapters shifted around, moved from one place to another. That book may have been completely restructured. And so whilst the idea of the behind the story is fantastic and the characters are great, structurally there is something missing in that first draft, and a book coach like me or an editor or an agent will kind of say to the writer, do you know what, there is lots and lots that's positive here, but we need to go back to the drawing board with the structure and examine it again. And sometimes that restructuring will happen in the planning stage. So if the writer is a planner and they have a very detailed synopsis up front, those structural anomalies can be seen up front and can be improved upon and worked on right at the beginning. For others, however, if you're like me and you're a pantser, you write by the seat of your pants, you're a discovery writer, you're a gardener, however you like to describe it, you actually need to write that story first in order to understand what it's about and how it's going to evolve and who the characters are and what it is that you're really trying to say with this story. So there's two different types of writers there, and with a planner, you can make those structural changes up front, but as we pantsers know, we've got to write that story, and only afterwards do we see where all the gaps are, do we see what's missing, do we see where things need to be rejigged. And sometimes, and it's horrible to do this, but sometimes we do need to go back to the beginning, totally rethink it and restructure it. And that's where thinking like a writer comes in. We're acknowledging that books are written in different ways, that there's a process to it. We don't jump in and write from chapter 1 through to chapter 50 and it's all nice and easy, and then the only revisions that we've got to do, well, let's tweak a few words here and there, look for some typos and some errors, and we're all done. Very, very, very few writers can do that. If any, I would imagine. All writers need to do some revision. There are those out there who are very, very experienced and who have been writing for a long time and know their process, and their process will now be a lot smoother than yours or mine, because we're at the beginning of our careers. We're at the beginning of that journey. So of course it's going to take us longer, and just acknowledging that and knowing that, I hope, will give you a bit more confidence to know you're not doing anything wrong if it takes you time to write your first, second, third book. We're still learning. We're absolutely still learning. But the reason I wanted to kind of bring this up is I was listening to a talk given by Dean Wesley Smith. And he's a very successful traditionally published writer, as well as a very successful indie writer as well. So he's got both. So he's been writing for a long time. And his advice really is just that you jump in and start writing. And it's with what he calls the creative voice. So you have an idea of your storyline and you jump in and you just get writing, and some things will be correct and some things will be wrong, and you can add things and take away things as you go along. Now, bearing in mind he is a lot further down the road than you or I are, this is kind of easier for him, and he's going to recognise where things are not working far sooner than you or I will. Experience is also kind of ingrained in his body, and he's naturally going to be better at storytelling than you or I will be, because, as I say, he's had that practice, he knows his process, and now it's in his bones, it's in his blood. He has the instinct, which you will get as well if you keep writing. But he says, just use your creative voice. Jump in and out of the story timeline as you go along, and you can add things to it, take things away, fix things as you go. He encourages us to write from the back of our brain. And this is something actually I talk about a lot, so I was quite pleased to hear him say the same thing, that there's a level of trust that we've got to have with our writing. And it's something I do talk to my students a lot about, is trusting that although the front of your brain can't quite see how everything is going to come together, the back of your brain already has it worked out. That subconscious brain kind of knows how this is going to happen. You've had the idea, you've been ruminating on it a while, lots of different ideas have been coming in and out of your brain at different times. You've probably been dreaming about the story without even realizing it, and your brain has been amassing all of these ideas and little by little putting them all together. And I see this a lot in my students who are at the beginning of their drafting process and they're questioning everything. They're not sure that it's all working out. But by the time they get to the second half of the book, or perhaps even in the second draft of the book, they start putting connections together and they start having ideas that fit in so brilliantly with that first half of the book. And they don't realize that they already had that idea in their head. They already knew about it in the back of their brain. It just hadn't made its way to the front of the brain. And they get this wonderful surprise and elation when they realize that all these little bits of pieces are coming together. All those pieces of jigsaw puzzle are all beginning to fit together, because the pieces were always there in the back of their brain. They just had to give it time, let the process work its way through the brain, and then everything would come to fruition and you'd have that picture by the end. This is what Dean Wesley Smith calls, it's your creative voice automatically knowing what's going to happen in the story. And there's a kind of a way that you don't need to worry about it. It will all come to fruition. So what he's saying with that is, and what I say is, don't worry too much about having, in fact, don't worry at all about having everything worked out ahead of time, especially if you are like me and you are a pantser. Don't worry that you haven't got the last 3/4 of the book worked out. You know how it starts and you've got this good idea in your story about, where the story begins, what it is that you want to say about life with the story, what's getting in your character's way, and you've done some work around your character. The rest will fall into place as you continue to write, because particularly for us pantsers, those magical ideas, those that free-form thinking comes when we are writing. It doesn't come in the pre-work usually. It comes as we're writing, as we're putting the words on the page, and we stop worrying about what's come before and what's going to come afterwards. But when we focus right there on the moment, in the moment of that scene, that's when we really get to kind of have that overused term, that blue sky thinking. But that's what happens when we're in that moment of writing. We can let go of all the shoulds and should nots and must haves and must nots, but just let the story come out, and we can what my director used to say, which is just tell the story. That's all you're trying to do, is tell the story. And when we're in the midst of that scene, we take away all that pressure and we just get down to telling the story, whether that be through description, or whether it be through dialogue, whether it be through backstory or internal thought. We just end up telling the story, and it takes a lot of the pressure away. So if you can do that, you're going to make life a lot easier for yourself. But you might be thinking, well, that's all very well, Emma, to just kind of woohoo, go with it and be all bohemian about it. But what about if I'm writing, in fact, it can be any genre, but I'm thinking particularly of a thriller or a crime story where you've got some foreshadowing that you want to put in. You've got some red herrings that you want to include in that story to make it more exciting. Well, very simply, you just go back and you add it in. Believe it or not, it's that simple. And that's the kind of thing, when I say that writing isn't complicated, when I say that novel writing isn't complicated, that's what I mean. I'm not saying it is easy, but it's surprisingly uncomplicated. So say you're writing your first draft and you realize that about 60% the way through, oh my goodness, I need to foreshadow this, or I need to put in another red herring here, or I've got an idea for a red herring and I want to include it. Well, you include it at that 60% mark. You write as if you've already included it, and then in your revision and your second draft, you go and add it in where you need it to be. And this is, again, kind of fits into this idea of thinking like a writer and not like a reader. You know that you need to include these things, but you as the writer have the advantage that you get to go back and add them all in. You don't have to write the book as your reader is going to read the book. You can jump in and out at any stage. You can add things in, take things out at any stage of the process of revision. But you've got to get that first draft down. You've got to get something down in order to see where the gaps are, to see where the structure isn't quite working, to see where you might need another character to add in an element to the story that's missing, or you might use that first draft to see where you've got too many characters and some of those characters are fulfilling the same role within the story, and so you get to take one out or merge the two into one. But you've got to have that draft down, and you can tell your story by all means, like a reader. You can tell your story in that first draft, but then your writer's got to come in and you've got to jump back to the beginning and work out and add in all the bits that are missing, where there's too much, where there's too little, and make all those changings that your reader is not going to see. Your reader's not going to see those by the end. By the time you get to your final draft and you're ready to either publish or to query, it's going to be seamless. It's going to be beautifully seamless. Your reader is not going to see that. And I remember talking to Troy Lambert from Plotter about this as well, and asking him that very same question, about how, what do you do? Because he writes crime. What are you going to do when you're adding in your red herrings and you need to foreshadow something? He said exactly that. Well, I add them in. I just go back to the beginning and I add them in where they need to be. So I hope I'm helping you see that there is, first of all, that writing a novel doesn't need to be complicated, that it can be simple. Hear me when I say simple, not easy, but it can be simple. And as humans, we tend to overcomplicate things. So it can be uncomplicated. So I want you to hear that first of all. But the most important thing I also want you to hear is that you need to change your thinking. You're thinking like a writer, not like a reader. And when you make that shift, I hope what you will do is take that pressure off yourself to get it right first time. I hope that what you will see is that a well-crafted, well-written story is written in layers. That the first draft is put down and all the basics are put in. And then through another draft, you're going to add in some more detail. In another draft, you're going to add in all those little clues that you want to add in, all that foreshadowing that you now know you need to include. In another draft, you are going to layer in all the emotions that your characters are feeling. Where you've not put that inner dialogue in, you're going to include it, because now you really know what your characters are thinking. You know what's bugging them and what they need to weigh up in their story. Then it's going to be another revision where you're adding in any textural details like the weather, the time of year that it might be, the clothes that they're wearing, descriptions of the city around them. So all of those things that perhaps have been missing but you know that you want to include. And in another revision again, you're going to be looking at more at the paragraph and sentence level and being happy with your word choices. And then there's going to be another revision where you're looking at typos and grammatical errors, and are you happy with where this comma is? Because I know commas are a big thing. But I want you to really, really hear that you rarely, if ever, write a novel in one go or two goes. It's a layering process. So even if you plan, and you can do the best planning in the world, there's still going to be things that you miss out. There are still going to be elements of your story that you learn as you go along and that you layer in on that second, third, fourth, fifth draft. For us pantsers, it can be even tougher. We might have even more layers to do because we're only learning the story as we write it, and then we've got to make those big changes afterwards. And that's the pros and cons of both, For me anyway, as a pantser, that's one of the pros of being a pantser, is the excitement in learning what's going to happen in this story. That's what I love about it. I love the magic that comes when I don't know something's going to happen. I don't know a character is going to say what they're going to say, that they start speaking to me. I love that magic, and I'm willing to exchange that and trade that magic in for knowing that there will be a lot of work to do on the back end. For others, the magic comes in the planning and they really, really enjoy that. And there's a trade-off by knowing the story up front to then not have to do that planning up front, to not have to do so much on the back end. Every type of storytelling has its pros and its cons. Either way, it's hard work. Either way, you've got to be committed to it. Either way, you've got to prioritize it and put in the time. And either way, it's a layering process. There's a process to it. And so please hear that when I tell you that. Please understand that it is a process and you are going to have to layer those things in. And when you do understand that, that's when you've made that shift from thinking like a reader to thinking like a writer. So I hope that's helped some of you in some way. Please do let me know in the comments or drop me an email at emma@emmadhesi.com to let me know if any of this resonated with you. And if you've got any other tips for making that shift between thinking like a reader to thinking like a writer, and if it's helped you in your storytelling as well. If you are not on my mailing list and you would like to, go along to emmadhesi.com and there you can download my 21 days of writing inspiration and join my mailing list. And on those 21 days, it'll be 21 days of short, snappy little videos of me offering some words of wisdom, words of encouragement, some learning that I've had and some observations that I've made along the years that hopefully will help you in your writing journey too. All right, thanks very much for today, and I will see you next time.